First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And it's particularly important for me to do that because as a Yorta Yorta man, I live on somebody else's country. I live here on Wurundjeri country. My children were born here. We live here, this is where we work. So when I acknowledge Wurundjeri country in particular, it's not just me doing it because I'm on someone else's country. This actually is where I am, so it's critically important. Now Auntie Di was to join us today, but apparently her car has broken down on the freeway, so she won't be joining us today. She hasn't had a very good time of it lately because she was supposed to do an opening at the Koori Heritage Trust on Saturday. She couldn't come to that either because she was feeling not well. So I think she probably needs a bit of a smoking to cleanse her spirits or something because it ain't working for her at the moment. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about diversity in leadership. It's actually not an easy topic to talk about or subject. So I have made some notes, but I also haven't done slides. Because one of the things which really, there's a few reasons why I don't use PowerPoint. One of them is I'm just hopeless at technology, so I'm just putting that straight out there. The second one, more importantly, is I like to use what I call an Aboriginal technique of communication. I talk, you listen, then we talk. And this I find very distracting for people. This stuff I find it's really important, works for others, it just doesn't work for me. And I find myself talking to that rather than to you. So that's why I don't use it. So you're going to get to stare at my mug for the next half hour if that's okay. Now in terms of my background around leadership, a lot of people who talk about leadership, who are into leadership, have done many courses, they've been to business schools, stuff of that nature. I haven't. Is there anybody old enough in the room who knows what a leaving certificate is? Anyone? Thank you. There's one. Two, yes. Two people who know what a leaving certificate is. That just makes me feel really old. So that's my highest level of education. That's what you used to get at year 11 or form 5 as it was then, was a leaving certificate. So I'm not talking to you from the aspect of being an academic, of having to be to a whole bunch of business schools and learn the theory of it. My background in this stuff is from doing it, from learning how to do it, getting it right, getting it wrong, making it up as you go, and hoping to God that you land in the right place. That's how I've learned about leadership and learned about diversity in leadership and the critical importance of it. So diversity, I'm sure we all know what it is. It's everyone. We're all different and we all have different stories to tell. None of us are the same. Diversity, in my view, a lot of people talk about it, and in Hosner's circumstance, that's right, it is about food and it is about music and it is about things of that nature, conversation. I prefer to think of it as it's just how everybody lives their life on a daily basis and it's different to everyone else's. And people come with their own stories and their own backgrounds, and 99.9% of those people ain't going to fit into your world perfectly. 90% of it might, but the other 10% won't because they're different from you. That's diversity. And why does it matter? Because it's all around us. We can't get away from it. It's not going anywhere. In fact, more and more of it is coming to us in an ever shrinking world, in an ever full world, in a world we're not isolated from anyone at any time, in a world where we're instantly on the other side of it. I went and saw Captain Marvel yesterday with my 17-year-old son. I had to explain to him what Blockbuster Video was for anybody who's seen Captain Marvel. But the other part was Captain Marvel was using an internet cafe. He didn't even know what an internet cafe was, which again made me feel really old. But having to explain to him, when people went overseas, I explained to him when Catherine and I, my wife, went overseas in 2000, we had to use an internet cafe to catch up with what was happening in Australia once a week. Now, and you're there. You don't actually have to run away. The world is shrinking. That's why diversity is important. It's all around us and it's everywhere, and we have to learn to live with it. So, in terms of diversity that I've had to deal with at a leadership level or at board levels, I hate using the term leader around myself because you don't set out to be a leader, it's something you become. And it's not something you endow upon yourself. You're only a leader if other people follow you. Otherwise, you're just a guy going for a walk by yourself. That's what you are. So, in terms of my reflections on, I guess, the leaders or the roles I've played to date that have led to me being in a position where people look to leadership from me and others as a collective. Government. Leadership in government. I'm going to put aside Parliament and those who are elected as ministers. You can make your own judgments. There's an election coming up, so you can make a real judgment there if you want. The public service. I've worked in the public service for just on 32 years. And I see diversity in it, and I've actually seen a change in the public service. Now, because I don't work in it anymore, I can say this. The public service is not as good as it used to be. It used to be much better. It used to think. It used to lead. It used to be much more diverse than it is. Now, there'll be those who will say, what do you mean by that? Because does not the public service have targets around women in leadership positions? Yes, it does. Does it have Aboriginal recruitment strategies? Yes, it does. And disability strategies, and so on and so forth. It has all those. But what it doesn't have anymore is a broad breadth of Australian society. What I mean by that is to now get in the public service, you have to have a bachelor's degree. You have to have graduated with a degree in tertiary education in something from somewhere. Now, notwithstanding the increased throughput of people into tertiary education, that leaves an awful lot of people out of ever getting into the public service. I just told you I've got my leaving certificate. I wouldn't get even look in the door now. Yet in the days when I joined, back in the 80s, all you had to do was the public service exam. If you could read, write, wipe your nose and tie your shoelaces, you got in. I went from being an admin 1 to what was the equivalent of a first assistant secretary with the Commonwealth, an executive director level with the state. You can't do that anymore. So that actual narrowing of the field of where people come from to work in government, it's got thinner. So it's actually lost a lot of its diversity of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, from people who have work skill as opposed to academic skill. I found that that's made it narrow. In terms of the not-for-profit sector, one of the things with the not-for-profit sector which I found too, and I work in, as you can see, I chair a lot of boards there, and involved with a lot of boards, is it is one which is driven by passion. And people are passionate about it, because you don't go to the not-for-profit sector to make $1. I mean, that's just flat. I mean, everyone knows that. The problem with the not-for-profit sector at times is people's passion can blind them to the business realities that they have to face. One of the boards I'm on, I came onto it at a time when the CEO lied to me about how great it was. It was fantastic. He loved it. Everything beautiful. Everything's going well. I learnt after that don't trust when people try to get you onto a board, because it's really swimming and it's swimming really well and it'll be great. They're sucking you into a vortex you can't get out of. But as I found out, in about a week after formally signing the documents, I got a briefing on what was actually happening. It was technically traded insolvently. It had an overblown workforce. Some of its staff were using it as a bit of a cash cow. Its board was far too big because it tried to accommodate people who were passionate about this subject matter. And if it had kept going, it would have just collapsed in a heap. So the then chair and the then CEO wanted me on the board because they'd heard I had a bit of a reputation of reorganising things that need to be reorganised. First thing we had to do was cut down on the passion. To stop people talking at board meetings about the subject matter. Don't want to hear about how great this thing is. Let's not do that. Let's focus on the stuff we need to. Let's focus on business. We actually had to get people on the board. We had to turn over board members, had to get some people on the board who actually weren't that interested in the subject matter but wanted to do something in the community sector. That was the first thing we did. Had to diversify it away from the passion. Had to diversify it away from two narrow groups who were making up the board and get other people on there as well, who brought their own insights from their communities, who brought their own insights from the businesses they run or what they're involved with, or a couple of them from other parts of the not-for-profit sector, different subject matter, but brought their insights to this organisation. It was really important to do that. one of the things I always talk about with those two as well was how they talk about diversity, government and organisations. They talk about diversity, but how well do they understand it? Quite often they don't. It is that thing about the world is changing. What do we need to think about? Why do we need to embrace diversity? Well, it's quite simple. If we don't, we get left behind. The world is changing. If we want to be part of it, we can either embrace this or get left behind by it. You can see there are, and I'll cite a few examples later, of organisations who haven't really caught up with the times and they're getting left behind. They're not keeping up with where they need to be. Or some organisations who, because they don't have diverse leadership, have got themselves in some awful trouble. And when I cite this example later, you'll know exactly what I mean. But when we look at, in your case, the diversity across the West, you saw the plan stuff before. I had a look at some statistics around population data for the West. I could have recited a lot of it, but I'm not going to. But there was the easy one. The western suburbs of metropolitan Melbourne have 50-50 male-female split. 65% are Australian born, 35% born overseas. Nearly 40% has a parent born overseas, and that's of those 65% who were born here. That means over a third of the population in the West has a direct link to people overseas. So they've got at least got probably a stronger identity to an overseas identity or background than they do to what's around them, or an equal one. That's actually thrown up a huge challenge for those of us who live in the West, who work in or look around the community that we're in. When you add other things on top of that, LGBTI, religion, economic, rich and poor, not many people think about economic diversity or economics as a diversity, but it is a diversity. I live in Yarraville. When I first bought in Yarraville, it wasn't a place like, everybody know Yarraville Village, Anderson and Ballarat. It's one of the hippest places in town, right, in Melbourne. It's kind of like what Brunswick Street used to be like in Fitzroy. But when I first moved to Yarraville, you could have let a bomb off in the middle of Yarraville on a Saturday morning and hit no one. There was one cafe that had dodgy coffee. I mean, it was, and I was a refugee from Richmond. That's why we bought over there, because we thought, well, why over there? We'll live there for a year, sell the house, and go back to civilisation in the eastern suburbs. That was in 1994. We've been there ever since. But economic diversity is something we have to come to terms with. Disability, education diversity, because now there is an education diversity. It's not simply two things, it's a number of things. And then there's groups within groups. In my own case, the Aboriginal community. One of the things that you as aged care providers have to get your head around is there are these subgroups within groups. And in the Aboriginal community, there's the general ageing Aboriginal population. And bear in mind, we're kind of new to the notion of aged care. We're only starting to move our life expectancy into that of other Australians. Within that group are the stolen children. Within that group are a particular group of people who have a diverse background that was actually this forum in May. It's going to be on. I really, really encourage you to go to that, because that's going to be something which is going to be big on your agenda as service providers. And I'll declare I have a personal interest in that. I am one of the stolen children myself. Now, in response to this, we need to adopt diversity. So what does it mean for organisations? Now, one of the things which I see a lot when people talk about diversity in organisations is we need to employ staff to be our contact staff. And that's a very worthy thing to do. We need to have Aboriginal people, for example, working with our Aboriginal clients, or we need to have people who are of an Islamic background working with our Islamic clients, or so on and so forth. That bothers me a great deal. A great deal. And the reason it bothers me is because it assumes that we have no role other than being direct service, other than being the coalface. One of the diversity plan, the Commonwealth Department diversity plan things, I read it yesterday. I read it twice just to make sure I got it right. But it says that if your client group is 5% or more Aboriginal, you should have an Aboriginal person on your board from a partner or collaborating organisation. Now, there is something fundamentally wrong with that. There is something that really ticked me right off. it assumes that Aboriginal people can only do Aboriginal stuff, and we're only interested in Aboriginal stuff. It assumes the only reason you should have an Aboriginal person on your board is because you have a number of blackfellas as clients. It assumes we're not capable of anything else other than talking about Aboriginal things. So on the surface of it, it might appear positive, but underneath it, it's lately putting us into a very narrow box, and it's wrong. None of the boards I am on is because I'm Aboriginal. All of the boards I am on, and particularly the ones I chair, are not because I'm Aboriginal. I bring my Aboriginality to it, but I just happen to be good at being a company director. I just happen to be good at strategic thinking, and I'm Aboriginal. And I bring my Aboriginal thought process to things. I can see things that others can't, because I'm just hardwired as a blackfella. And when there's very few of you at board level, at governance levels, you actually make a really big contribution. I used to be involved in football here in the western suburbs. I'll give you a quick quiz. Who knows what I was in footy? Okay, I didn't play in any of the clubs here in the western suburbs. Certainly not a coach. I was not an umpire, nor was I, some kid once said to me, "Were you the water boy?" No, I wasn't the water boy. I got involved in football here in the western suburbs because they wanted to do some racial vilification stuff. I ended up within 3 years as president of the Western Region Football League. That's the one that covers the entire west of Melbourne. I ended up changing that organisation, lifting it out of the 1970s into the early 2000s to the point where AFL Victoria cited it as the example that every other football league in Victoria should aspire to be like. I did it without people, and I did it surprising people that I'm an Aboriginal person and my involvement with football didn't happen on the ground. It showed people that Aboriginal people in sport can do more than play the game, we can run the game. Now that is also true for every other group. I reckon, with all the diversity groups, a person with a disability serving on the board isn't going to be just talking about disabled stuff. They could be the person who brings the legal expertise your board lacks. They could be the person who brings the financial expertise your board lacks. They just happen to be in a wheelchair. Doesn't make them a second-rate accountant, it just means they're in a wheelchair. You also transpose this to executive leadership within your organisations as well. One question I like to ask people is, how many Aboriginal people do you have in senior executive positions? And the answer routinely is no. Unless, of course, it's an Aboriginal organisation, unless, of course, there is a particular focus on Aboriginal stuff. The universities in Australia are running around at the moment appointing pro-vice-chancellors Indigenous because the Commonwealth Government has made them. So suddenly there's a great increase in Aboriginal people at vice-chancellor level or pro-vice-chancellor level in universities. Looks really great, except they're all in the Indigenous space. On the surface of it, it's good, but gee, I'd like to see a pro-vice-chancellor education who just happens to be Aboriginal. Pro-vice-chancellor medicine who happens to be Aboriginal. We have to go there. We actually have to make it happen. So what do diversity do at these higher levels? Well, quite frankly, it makes you a better organisation. It makes you an organisation that has an advantage that nobody else does. It helps you think outside the box in this increasingly complex world that I was talking about before. Any organisation has to do that these days. It's simply not straight up and down as it used to be. You're in a world, as I said, that gets smaller. Your client base as aged care providers is broadening, it's extending, it's becoming more mixed. You're not going to be able to cope with it simply by having more coalface workers who are from a diverse background. Your organisations are going to have to do it from the top down. It does mean your boardrooms are going to have to change. It does mean your senior executive levels are going to have to become more diverse and change as well. That will give you an advantage over your competitors. That will give you the necessary tools you need to get this right. Because if you don't, you'll find that you get left behind. You'll find you have problems that your competitors don't. And this is really especially so in the community and human services sectors. If you're in the service provision areas of stuff, so say like the one that always comes to mind is the banking sector, you are providing a service which is around banking. You still have to be aware of the diversity of the clients you serve, but your interaction with them is around their financial, how they operate their finances. But if you're in the community and human services areas, your interaction with them is how they are as people, how they live their lives on a daily basis, how are they living in your aged care facilities or in the home care packages you provide. So understanding of their diverse needs, understanding not only their diverse needs, just understanding who they are, whether they need anything or not. That's going to be very critical for this whole sector. In terms of the outcome, how it hits you in an economic sense, this is something when people talk about diversity or social inclusion or things like that, they don't think of the economics of it. They don't think of what does that mean in a business sense. So the Boston Consulting Group last year released a study. They found that organisations that have a diversity throughout their workforce, from their boardroom right down to the person who is regarded as the lowest on their employment strata, those organisations had a 19% increase in revenues over organisations that don't. 19% increased revenue. That's a deal breaker. That's an organisational arse buster, to be honest. That's the difference between succeeding and failing as a business. There's a big economic imperative to do this. It also crosses over into another area I've worked in for a few years, which is how to use economic policy to alleviate social issues. Too often we look at social policy issues to be relieved through social policy only. As Bill Clinton said in his 1992 election campaign, it's the economy, stupid. How do we use the economy to address social disadvantage? How can your organisations tick off a number of things at once? And the use of diversity in terms of an economic outcome, because at the end of the day, many of you work for for-profit organisations and even not-for-profit. Not-for-profit doesn't equate to for poverty or not making a buck. I think there's some people who get that a bit mixed up. That sure, we can run at a deficit because we're doing the right thing. Wrong, you can't. You actually have to run at a surplus. Profit is for those who make a profit. Surplus is that bit that's left over for a not-for-profit after you've taken away all your expenses. That's your reinvestment money. That's the money you need to have for the unforeseen. That's the money you have to have to ensure that your business continues, that you can continue providing those community services that you want to, and do other things such as provide opportunities right across the whole length and breadth of your organisation and up and down the whole lot of it for the diverse communities you live in. You need to have that money. There's also something else that your sector needs to consider now, and it's in your face. I did write down this word. I thought I won't use it, but I'm going to use it. The word poleaxe comes to mind. You've got a Royal Commission. You've got a Royal Commission right now which is looking at you and looking at you big time. Now, I've done work in the banking sector, so the First Nations Foundation, we do financial literacy for Aboriginal people. We do access to financial services. We work with the Australian Banking Association, the Financial Services Council, and the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees. They're the peak bodies for that entire sector. Now, that sector just got poleaxed by a Royal Commission. I mean, it just got smacked up something bad, and it's continuing. One of the problems, particularly at its board and executive level, in case you haven't noticed, they're all 50-plus-year-old white people who live in a nice part of town. Notwithstanding some of them are women, and that's an important thing to say, because I asked somebody at the Australian Institute of Company Directors about this, about diversity in the banks, and he said, look, seriously, it's like this. Yes, they're diversifying by having women on boards and in senior executive roles. But they all went to St Catherine's and the boys went to St Kevin's. apart from being, male, female, they're actually the same. That's led to a lot of the problems the banking sector has. This sector, I'll give you the heads up, you need to start looking now at what you've got at the top, what you've got at your management, at your executive levels, even all the way down, right down into your entire workforce. That will help you deal with some of those issues which the banking people have found themselves in. They simply didn't understand the world around them. They simply didn't understand what their role as a social, as part of the social construct of Australia, they simply didn't understand it because they just didn't come from it. They come from a nice, neat little like that. This sector needs to think of that as well. So, what does it mean for you in your daily life? Well, I know some of you actually from executive positions, and I believe there's even a couple of board directors here. Others of you are simply managers in a particular place trying to make the daily grind work. This isn't easy. I'm not going to pretend it is. This is hard. This is a challenge. But it's one you should embrace, one we need to embrace. One which makes your organisations better. You look at the AFL, for example. Peggy O'Neill, President of Richmond, she won us a flag. The AFL has appointed an Aboriginal woman to the commission, and women commissioners have made the AFL a better organisation. They've brought intellectual depth that wasn't there before. My favourite example of intellectual depth increasing and making institutions better is the US Supreme Court with the appointment of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And now, sadly, it's decreased in the number of women, but there will never again be no women on the US Supreme Court. It's made, her intellectual capacity has made it just a better body. And in fact, the current Chief Justices of the Victorian Supreme Court and the Australian High Court are both female. And it has brought a different dimension to the court. Coalface line managers though, that's a world away from you. But you should be thinking about, and this is what I do when I think about this stuff. What do I want to leave? What's the legacy that I want to leave for the next generation of leaders, of clients, of who I work with? What impact do I make on the people around me? Can I make this a better place? That's what I think about when I work with people, when I'm on boards, when I'm doing jobs, whatever it is. Am I doing something worthwhile? If I'm not, then why am I doing it? I mightn't change everything at once, but if I leave something planted in people's heads after I'm gone, yes, we need to go down this path, they get it, and it's much better. So, you have the time now to, I guess you have the time now to think about where are we going, what are we doing. This is a challenge actually that you can't turn away from, and I noticed there was something on the ABC News last night, it was in the business report, and it really stuck out. There was a survey done in the OECD countries. And it was just this quick little thing in the business report, but it said there'd been a decline in support for international trade cooperation, which kind of worried the business person. He said, because, and when you look at it, you've got Donald Trump wanting to do, have trade wars with China and everyone else, Brexit, Britain wanting to isolate itself. In Australia even, there are those who want to withdraw from world trade. It would kill us as a country. But he also put up another one, which really worried me. There's also been a corresponding steep decline in support for international cultural cooperation and understanding. It's one thing to walk away from trade. It's another thing to walk away from the rest of the world and go back in your box and pretend it isn't there. That's a real problem. We can't afford it in the suburbs and the towns that we live in. We can't afford to do it internationally. You can't afford to do it in your organisations. If you do this for no other reason, you need to do it because it's the right thing to do. Thank you.